Hi there, I'm Josh, and today we are talking about the Ryzen 9 5900X, the old top-end CPU. One of the highest-end CPUs you could buy on the AM4 platform before getting replaced by AM5. It released on November 5th, 2020, had 12 cores, 24 threads, a base clock of 3.7 GHz and a boost clock of 4.8 GHz, had 6 MB of L2 cache, and a TDP of 105 watts. So what I've done today is test this thing to its ultimate limits, as well as test it at a reasonable resolution. What I have is 16 gigs of RAM, which I have 32, and they're all lit up. I don't know what the issue is, but I'll see if I can figure that out later on, because RAM plays a huge issue as to whether or not the CPU can run. So today we're doing a 16 gigabyte of RAM test on the 5900X. I ran it at 1920 by 1080 with the lowest settings, and I run it at 3440 by 1440p with the highest settings on all games except for Starfield, because Starfield bottlenecked right out of the bat at 3440 by 1440p. Which can you expect any less? But the real kicker is we're using an RTX 4090, which means we are going to see how much of a bottleneck is created when using the highest end GPU with one of the older architectures of Ryzen at the highest end possible. So let's get into the benchmarks. Starting off with one of the most CPU-intensive games, Starfield ran with 68 FPS, a 1% low of 1, and a 0.1% low of 1. So we saw stutter, definitely. And if you look in the top left corner, even though there was a weird bug, you can see that the GPU is being utilized anywhere between 50 and 70%, whereas the CPU is being used anywhere between 40 and 50% most of the time, if not above 50%, which means that we are seeing a gigantic bottleneck. But Starfield should not be the game that you base this decision on, because it's such a CPU intensive game. No matter what you're playing on, it's almost a guarantee that your CPU is going to bottleneck if you have a relatively well built PC. One last eyeball benchmark is Counter-Strike 2. At 1080p with the lowest settings, we saw an average frame rate of 296. Now this on its own is impressive, but when we go to Counter-Strike 2 at 3440 by 1440p with the very high settings, we saw an average frame rate of 275 FPS. So you're only getting about 20 more frames per second, jumping from 3440 by 1440 to 1080p. So although the result is really good and you have no issues playing Counter-Strike 2 on your PC, there's a clear bottleneck here as well from the 5900X. And now for some empirical data. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 1080p at the lowest settings ran with an average frame rate of 231. So a very impressive result, but as you can see by the screenshot, there was a 98% CPU bottleneck on the 4090. Would you ever use a 4090 to play at 1080p at the lowest settings? Absolutely not. This was just worst case scenario. What happens to be more interesting is when you switch it up to 3440 by 1440p, we saw 155 FPS average, which means that the FPS was cut significantly, but we still saw a bottleneck of 14% on the CPU. So even at a high resolution, there was still some bottleneck from the CPU, albeit not much, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Up next is Assassin's Creed Mirage. At 1080p with the lowest settings, we saw an average frame rate of 141, a 1% low of 104, and a 0.1% low of 85. And at 3440 by 1440p with the ultra high settings, we saw an average frame rate of 90, a 1% low of 55, and a 0.1% low of 45. So there was about a third of a difference between frame cuts. Obviously the CPU is going to be bottlenecked to 1080p, but what we're seeing here is the CPU pushing as many frames as it can by using the 1080p lowest settings, which is why I decided to run it, because this is pretty much the maximum output without overclocking that this CPU will be able to do. Cyberpunk 2077 at the 1080p low settings ran with an average frame rate of 136, a 1% low of 90, and a 0.1% low of 79. So when we combine this with the 3440 by 1440p ultra average, which was 114 FPS, a 1% low of 83, and a 0.1% low of 71, we see that there was significant bottlenecking because the frame rate isn't that much different. Now this game is an oldie but one of my favorites, and the reason why I added it to this benchmark is because it has a very sophisticated benchmark tool, which I'll show you as the gameplay plays in the background. We saw an average frame rate at 1080p with the lowest settings of 198. And we can see that it was GPU bound 60% of the time and CPU bound 40% of the time, which means that there was a CPU bottleneck present. And once again, when we switch to 3440 by 1440p, we see an average frame rate of 129, but the CPU bottleneck is only 3.2%, which is not bad, but still showcasing a little bit of a bottleneck within the game. So should you pair an R9 5900X with an RTX 4090? The answer is probably not, but that doesn't mean it's a bad CPU. If you are still on the AM4 platform, say you have a 3600 and you want to upgrade, I would say if you're gaming, go for the 5800X 3D. If you're doing productivity, go for the 5900X. But your best bet is probably a 7800X 3D, which is universally known as the best gaming CPU right now. Still, even those will not top out a 4090 without some bottleneck. And this CPU will likely run well at higher resolutions with anything that's not a 4090. I think even a 4080 would run fine if you're running it at 1440 or 4K. Now, if you're trying to run games at 1080p, then probably a 4060 would do. Maybe a 4070, but I wouldn't go any higher than that if you're running games at 1080p for a multitude of reasons. But in this specific case, because the 5900X won't be able to keep up all the time. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, like, subscribe, do what you usually do. And as always, buy yourself something nice. So I have an eBay where I sell things that is linked in the description below. I sell graphics card that I use on this channel, so they are always tested working unless stated otherwise. I also have a Patreon, which you can join for just $1 a month if you want to support me. And I also have a Discord, which you can join for free.